Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more the executive branch of the United States. Today we're dealing with uh, doing an overview look of a new president. After Jefferson leaves, we get president number 4, James Madison. As you can see on the screen here, they even have a university named after him in Virginia, JMU Bulldogs, James Madison University. Now, as you remember, Jefferson left. Presidency was doing pretty good. The nation doing pretty good. We were in a strong setup. There were still issues. There's no doubt about that. And the can of Civil War was being kicked down the road over the slavery issue. We would still go away before reaching that, but it was starting to build. Instead of shutting it down first thing, we let it in, and the right to own people was just like, hey, we make money off that. We make a living off that. I don't care, the people. Anyway, but we've expanded the size of the nation with the Lewis and Clark expedition and everything under Jefferson. And one of Jefferson's people, I think Lewis and Clark, or not Lewis and Clark, but James Madison was actually Secretary of State. Yeah, James Madison. And even before that, he held, I'm wanting to say he held a position for Washington. No, he didn't. He held for James Madison. James Madison was Secretary of State under Jefferson. And so, with that being the case, the next president we would get in line is James Madison. If I can get everything to scroll up quickly. He would be elected in 1808 and would be elected again in 1812. So he would have a full 2 straight terms. And remember, at this point in history, there is no limit to the terms you can have. It's before FDR was so unimaginably popular that he got in 4 straight times. And the Republicans cried, mercy! And so an amendment was made that they could only have 2 terms and an extra 2 terms if they served as vice president or whatever in extraordinary circumstances where the normal president has passed or is unable to perform his rights and everything. Now, like I said, 4th president. He was part of that famous Virginia quartet. If you do not know of the first 5 presidents. 4 were from Virginia: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. So yeah, 4 of the first 5 were Virginians. And you consider the fact that Jamestown was the first successful colony. The United States pretty much is grown from Virginia. Well, first successful English colony, we should say. There were other successful colonies in the New World, but they weren't necessarily English. But yeah. He would defeat Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Remember, Pinckney, I think he served as a member of Washington's cabinet. If I remember right. He did a couple other things, but yeah, statesman, military officer, founding father. Member of the Constitutional Convention who signed the Constitution. So a lot of these names we'll be seeing are big names, especially early on. But Madison would defeat Pinckney in 1808, and to get re-elected, he would defeat DeWitt Clinton, who was an American politician and naturalist who served as a senator, mayor of New York City, and the 6th governor of the state of New York. And largely responsible for the construction of the Erie Canal. So again, major names. But Madison would best Pinckney and Clinton. Would be president during the War of 1812, in which Britain invaded the U.S. and famously burnt the White House to the ground. And one of the things that was often cited is Dolly Madison, before escaping the White House, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, took the picture of George Washington as one of the few things she took with her and left, escaping the oncoming British who would destroy the White House. But yeah. And would be one of the founding members of the Democratic Republican Party. We have the Federalists, we have the Whigs. The Whigs disappeared, the Federalists were there, and then eventually the Democratic Republican Party came around. Yeah. Into existence. His presidency dominated by the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. Like we said, he wins in 1808 and then in 1812 again, and that's when the War of 1812 happens. Yeah. Remember, during the Jefferson presidency, we were saying, quit taking our guys. Quit performing impressment upon them. Quit taking our sailors, our men. They are not yours to use in your wars. And as we tried to put a little bit of economic pressure on them after the War of 1812, or the Napoleonic Wars, were kind of looking in the bag, they turned their attention to the colonies, and we had the War of 1812, which we got our butts kicked. We won the revolution, but turn around and yeah, we had a victory in the Barbary Wars, but when we came to the War of 1812, Britain resoundingly thumped us. So yeah. Madison is also one of the main writers of the Federalist Papers. Remember Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison wrote the papers, the Federalist Papers, which is kind of interesting. James Madison was an ally of Thomas Jefferson, but Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were ideological foes in the way they saw things. So it's kind of interesting. Oh yeah, and father of the Constitution. We talk about Jefferson being the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. Same is true of Madison for the Constitution. He would do the bulk of the writing and everything. So yeah. Probably why there was a idea of a three-fifths compromise in there, because I know the southern states wanted it in there. Madison has a bit of history of being a bit of a racist. So yeah. Like I said, a lot of these early founding fathers have very conflicting histories, especially early on. Some of them were genius in their ideas, in their writings, but also had some horrible habits, horrible beliefs. Please disengage any thoughts that they were infallible. They were men. They were very fallible. But yeah. Like I've explained here, though, Madison, much like Jefferson, big ideal men in creating the nation, putting pen to paper for founding documents. Yeah. But, yeah. And, most people talk about the relationship between John Adams and his wife when it comes to first ladies. Not a whole lot is said about Jefferson's wife or Washington's wife, although Washington's wife does get some accreditation, because I live close to the town of Abingdon. Well, not close, but it's not far. And they have there the Martha Washington Inn, which is named after George Washington's wife, Martha Washington. But what I'm getting to, Dolly Madison gets a fair bit of acclaim as well as a first lady. So that's another thing we'll be looking at. Let's go ahead and dig into this a little bit. Madison would introduce a number of Supreme Court justices. Remember, this is early on. He would introduce Gabriel Duvall, who would be an associate justice replacing Samuel Chase. He would introduce Joseph Story, who would be an associate justice replacing Cushion. But yeah, that looks like all he would get to nominate was those two justices. Because at that point, most of the most of the justices were already well established with the primary number of people. There wasn't a whole lot of heavy expansion at this point, even being just the fourth president. But yeah. Now, he would have a number of members in his cabinet. His vice president would be George Clinton, which, if I remember right, was Jefferson's second vice president. Yep. 1805 to 1809. Madison would have him up until the War of 1812. For almost a year there, he's without a vice president. Then he gets, for about a year, Elbridge Gerry, which I think his name is actually pronounced Gary, but we call it Jerry since he's the man for whom gerrymandering is named after. Yeah, it goes this far back. And then in 1814, throughout the rest of the presidency, he wouldn't have another vice president. So, yeah. Secretary of State, he had two, Robert Smith and James Monroe. That was Secretary of State, sorry. Secretary of the Treasury, he would have Albert Gallatin, George W. Campbell, Alexander J. Dallas, and William H. Crawford. Secretary of War, William Custis, John Armstrong Jr., James Monroe. Yeah, as we've already kind of mentioned, Monroe becomes fifth president, so it's clear he did what was needed. William H. Crawford, there he is again. So apparently he started out Secretary of Treasury and was Secretary of War for a short time. And then ending up as acting was George Graham as acting Secretary of War. Attorney General, Caesar Augustus Rodney, William Pinckney, and Richard Rush. I wonder if William Pinckney is any related to Charles Pinckney. Interesting. And Secretary of the Navy, Paul Hamilton, William Jones, and Benjamin Williams Crowninshield. What a name. That sounds almost fake. And Crowninshield. Yeah. But anyway, members of his cabinet, who he would put on the court. He would acquire West Florida from Spain, the panhandle essentially. And it would become, well, it's further out from the panhandle, but it become the bottom parts of Alabama and Mississippi is what they would become. So that's cool. Like we mentioned, Battle of 1812, but apparently the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars engulfed Europe since the early 1790s. Remember, they had their revolution in 1792, I'm wanting to say. Napoleon had won a decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and as a consequence, Europe remained mostly at peace for the next few years, but tensions continued on the high seas, where the U.S. had long traded with France and Britain. We get the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon so he could focus on Europe and make some extra money. Yeah, the Jefferson administration passing the Embargo Act of 1807, cutting off trade with Europe because of impressment. Early 1809, Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which opened trade with foreign powers other than France and Britain. Yeah. This big issue was still that impressment of sailors by the British. Collapse of the Federalists post-war. Now remember, Federalists were John Adams' party. They were still pretty strong. They were the party of Alexander Hamilton. Second Barbary War. Indian policy or treatment of Native Americans. Constitutional amendments. Congress approved an amendment that would strip citizenship from any citizen who accepted the title of nobility from a foreign country and submitted it to the state legislatures for ratification, but the proposed amendment, commonly known as the Titles of Nobility Amendment, was not ratified by the required number of states and is still technically pending before the states. States admitted to the Union under Madison: 2, Louisiana and Indiana. So yeah, we'd pick up Louisiana, Indiana. The states won during, states, territories, and how they went according to that election between DeWitt Clinton and James Madison. Madison won the South and Vermont. While the rest went DeWitt Clinton, which he was a big name in New York politics, so it's understandable. New York, and being in the Northeast, I'm sure much of the surrounding area knew who he was. Okay. Alright. But that looks like the majority of the information for an overview of Madison's time in office. We'll get down into this more in-depth in the next few episodes, seeing as we have to look at new members of his cabinet, his vice presidents and everything, because we're getting a lot of new names now. Because remember, there were a lot of holdovers from Jefferson to Adams, and I think even from Adams to Jefferson. Not so much Jefferson to Madison. We're getting a lot of new people, so yeah. But these are still a lot of names you'll probably come across if you study U.S. history. But with that, we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you had trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting these links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.